Okay, folks, it is time, or it's one past the time here. Whatever time it is for you. For us, is 3:01. I believe that Alex is just starting his afternoon in California, and for the folks in France, maybe late as 9 o'clock, maybe, and 5 o'clock in Brazil. So it's a pleasure to start the 12th Rio de la Plata workshop. Is the very first, though, that is online. Uh, it's perhaps the proof that we can survive a pandemic as a community. And it is an immense pleasure to have now an expanded community. For many years, we've been doing this with just face-to-face, reduced number of scholars. But I think that if there is a silver lining to the pandemic, is that our community has expanded and we can have many people from different parts of the world together to discuss, to talk about a region that some people may say that is the center of the world, but it may or may not be. Nonetheless, I think that is interesting enough, and it's a great pleasure to see that so many people are interested in the history of Rio de la Plata, broadly construed, of course, including southern Brazil here. But so, without further ado, we'd like to. This year we have a book slam. We are celebrating and provoking further thought here, discussing the books, 6 excellent books. And that at certain point, I think that all these books have at least one chapter or a piece of a chapter that was workshopped in the Rio de la Plata workshop. So it's like, it's fantastic to see great friends and colleagues publishing high, top quality work. So thank you so much to Sean Austin and to Jeffrey Erbig, David Freeman, Billy Ackrey, Erica Edwards, and Jeffrey Shumway for joining us. And of course, are my two partners in crime in the creation of this workshop since day one, Viviana Grieco and Alex Borucki. And Julia Sarreal was too in those early, very first editions of this workshop when we were in Chicago still. So today we'll be discussing 3 books. First one, and we're gonna have a system of we're gonna have a couple of questions that each author will answer. And after we go over the 3 authors, we will open for the audience. So we expected more or less 45 minutes for the authors, and then the remaining 45 minutes will be questions from the audience. And for the questions, once we go to that, I would ask for you people to use the raise hand function on the chat once we are done. But at the moment, let's get started. And so it is a pleasure to have with us today Professor Sean Austin, who's the author of Colonial Kingship, Guarani, Spaniards, and Africans in Paraguay. Also, we have Professor David Freeman, A Silver River in a Silver World, Dutch Trade in the Rio de la Plata, 1648, 1678. And Professor Jeffrey Erbig, who is the author of Where Caciques and Map Makers Met, Border Making in 18th Century South America. All these books are fresh from the oven or from the presses. Buy them, they are great. And with that, I pass, I give the floor to the authors and to Viviana Grieco, our interviewer of the day, co-host of the Rio de la Plata workshop.
So hello to everyone. I'm not going to repeat anything that Fabricio has already said. We mentioned in the 10th anniversary of the Rio de la Plata workshop that this meeting yielded several books. Many of the ones that we're discussing today were not out by then, but we knew they were forthcoming. It has been a great venue to advance research and to come together and discuss new ideas. And the results are there. This group publishes articles, books, book reviews, everything that is being regarded an academic publication comes out of this group, and we're very proud of the achievements. So for today, we pre-circulated 3 questions to the authors that are contributing to this discussion. And so I will read the 3 questions, and then we wait for the answers. We asked the authors to keep their answers within 15 minutes. So basically they have 5 minutes for each question, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. And so I'm going to read the first question for today. We take one author at a time, so we keep confined within the limits of one book at a time, and then we move to the next author, and then we move on. So after I explain the format, as I'm the interviewer today, the questions will be managed by Alex, and then I can take some of the questions. You can submit them to the Q&A. Alex and Fabricio will point at the questions that need to be answered. Okay, so we're ready to start. And we're going to start with the first question of the day. And so the first question is, what has been the major contribution of your book to the historiography of the Rio de la Plata or to the Atlantic? Because many of these books converse with different historiographies. So we start with that first question, and we can have our first author coming into the table and discuss with us, please.
I assume that's me.
Yes, Sean.
Thank you, Fabricio, for having us. This is a wonderful event, and I'm just so glad to see so many wonderful colleagues and scholars and people whose work has been fundamental for my own and inspirational. Many people who worked on my book as supposedly anonymous peer reviewers, but there's so few of us that it's just hard not to know each other. And for Viviana and Alex for working the questions today. So thank you all for having us. It's wonderful to be here with everybody. So the book, I approached the study of the history of Paraguay through my advisor at the time in my dissertation work, who was an Andeanist and who was trained by James Lockhart. And so I was trained by somebody who's thinking about kind of central and peripheral regions. And as I had started to look at the history of colonial Paraguay, I just noticed how much what Lockhart calls overlay, right? A kind of palimpsest of colonial imperial institutions that overlay perhaps Nawa institutions. And I started to think about, as I'm reading documents from Paraguay, that there's not necessarily an overlay, but something new is being built here. And so I think that this main significance of the work is to provide a different perspective on colonial Paraguay that perhaps moves a bit away from a Las Casian narrative of just brute, outright force and the complete devastation of indigenous populations. There's certainly a declension and a decline that's going on, but what I'm tracing is the impact of kinship as it's being reconstructed through colonial contact. So there's this beautiful phrase that comes up in 1620s that just jumped off the pages. This has got to be it, right? An anonymous Jesuit priest says that Asuncion was conquered less by physical force or conquest than it was by kinship, right? Or these interethnic unions that were taking place. These unions were, obviously filled with force and coercion, but at the same time, Guarani contributed this idea of the tovarja, right? This brother-in-lawship to the institution. So I hope that that is the main contribution of the work, is to provide a different lens onto Spanish-Guarani relations. The methodology also is somewhat new to the field, at least, to the field of Paraguay at least, and that I was the first to use systematically litigation records to try to access the lives of Guarani peoples and to try to understand how Guarani peoples are interacting with Spaniards. Surprised to see so many women in those sources. And I hope that the book is also seen as shedding new light on groups of people who are just not part of the other narratives because they're not included in many sources, official reports and what have you. So the litigation records shine light on that. And as well as I was surprised at the time to discover so many African slaves in the documents. And so an opportunity was presented to think about African slavery in the context of Cuñadazgo. So that's how I'd answer that question.
Thank you very much. We go to the second question. What have you learned as an author and scholar from engaging in the research for this book? And let me tell the audience that this is a broad question. We ask the authors to tackle it from very many points of view. So freedom to answer it whatever you want.
Me again, right? We're just
yes, yes.
on.
We're following one author at a time. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, this is a fun question to kind of think through. When I was preparing to go to Paraguay for my first research trip, I called down to the archive and said, "Do you have litigation records? Do you have them cataloged and organized?" And I was assured that they were. And so I went down there and come to find out that they had only been cataloged and organized a month or two before I arrived. So just the fortuitousness, right, of arriving at a time when these records had finally been cataloged. And so it was, you think about the structure of the archive, the way that the archive shapes narratives and shapes our understanding of a nation's past. This is a theme that's really stood out to me. I don't attribute my work to any fundamental changes in the Paraguayan historiography, but since those changes in the archive have taken place, I've seen a tremendous growth in social history coming out of Paraguay. Scholars are organizing institutes and events, and there's more research being done. And I think that's due to the structure that the archive has now taken and is taking. And the great work of the archivists there to build spaces in which people can think about Paraguayan history outside of these romanticized kind of great men narratives. And so I found that to be a really interesting part of the story of doing this work. So that, I think that was one major takeaway. I think one last thought, thinking about what it takes to create a narrative that is a borderlands narrative. And Jeff Erbig wins the prize on this one. You look at the list of archives that he's visited, it's just astounding. But it takes, right, doing that kind of work to get this kind of perspective. And so, I certainly am not doing as much as Jeff does, and the borderlands perspective is not as strong in my book. But these kinds of different approaches are important. So I think that's where I'd stop there.
All right, thank you. I'm going to ask you the third question. What scholarly plans do you have for the future? Do you plan to use this book as the platform for future research? Do you plan to depart from this type of work or region?
Yeah, I'm going to stay focused on Guarani peoples. I'm interested now in turning towards the theme of militias. The Guarani militias both within the Jesuit context and then in the secular Franciscan context. Again, Jeff brings up this term in his book, and I found his discussion of it fascinating, but the concept of a plaza and a plaza de armas in a community. What is the significance for a Guarani reducción to have a plaza de armas? And what is the significance also for indigenous peoples to possess firearms? We know something now over the last 2 decades about Indians in arms, right? Indians as Indian conquistadors and Indians, actually fighting against the crown or fighting with Spaniards. But we don't know a whole lot about what it meant for an Indian to have arms, to possess arms. I think that firearms acquire, even in the early modern period, a kind of political and moral weight. And so I'm interested in exploring this a little bit more through the example of the Guarani, who have this tremendous militia system. And so I'm also wanting to adopt a new methodology for this. Last March, I began taking lessons from a fantastic linguist, Leonardo Serno, and studying Guarani. And I just feel like I'm barely swimming. It's just such an incredibly difficult language and challenging approach, but it's been extremely rewarding. And so I'm hoping to use a significant amount of Guarani language text to help me address this question of the militias. Harald Thun, Franz Obermeier, Leonardo Serno did this heroic translation work of this document called the Guarani Hape Tokukwe, which is what happened in the war, which is about the siege of Colonia de Sacramento. And it's this just incredibly rich document that gives us so many new perspectives on Guarani, perhaps mixed with Jesuit, also sort of interpretations of their battle against the Portuguese. So it seems to me a really rich avenue for understanding Guarani ways of participating in reducción life and more broadly the kind of regional imperial life in which they're engaged. So that's the next project.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, for your comments and answering these questions. We would like to open the floor for discussion and questions from the audience. So we will remain with you, and then we can have more time with other colleagues.
No, actually, we're gonna save the questions for one block at the end.
Oh,
so
okay.
We're gonna go for the second interviewee, right? And then we're gonna have a block at the end, 40 minutes, that we can discuss for the audience, can present questions for multiple authors.
All right, so save your questions for the very end. Thank you. And we have David next. Yes?
Yes,
let me ask you the first question.
I can just go through the questions if you want. If you don't want to ask them again, they're in the text and we heard them before.
Okay, sounds good.
I would say that to start out, that I didn't start out as a Spanish colonial historian. That I wasn't, and I'm still. I mean, I was, and I still am to a certain extent a Dutch historian, or maybe historian of the Atlantic world. And so when we think about things like the Rio de la Plata workshop and Fabricio and Alex and Viviana, this is really them inviting me, as at least originally a kind of outsider, into the world of Spanish colonial history as an intellectual group and as a social group as well, obviously. So originally, when I was sort of conceptualizing this book, I was thinking how it fit in the Dutch historiography, not the sort of the Spanish colonial historiography, and the Dutch sort of global historiography, in sort of the Dutch history of history, it's the VOC and the WIC, the East India Company and the West India Company, that are the two main focuses. And was always sort of seen as sort of winners and losers. The VOC as the winners, the WIC as the losers. And so for traditional history, beginning really in the 19th century and onwards, then the VOC and the East Indies was the focus. And the Atlantic world was not very ripe for study, because that was, essentially the failure as they're looking into beginning in the late 19th and into the 20th century. That changed, of course. And there was a better understanding of the Atlantic world as a place for independent merchants rather than for the WIC. The problem was that this is much harder to study. This is more dispersed, I should say. And as with anything, you're thinking about archives, and the notary records, especially in Amsterdam, are not well organized. So for the Atlantic world, or the Dutch Atlantic world, there tends to be sort of two areas of study. One is Brazil, and what went wrong for the West India Company there. And then the other is the Caribbean and Curacao, and sort of by extension, those people who study New Amsterdam. But there's a nice sort of chronological hole between the end of Brazil and the beginning of Curacao, if you want. And there's that kind of, where are Dutch merchants going? Wim Klooster writes a lot about this, writes about Dutch trade in the Caribbean. And obviously influential in my work, but I wasn't satisfied with his sort of, the title of his book is Illicit Riches. He's looking at smuggling, but I wasn't really satisfied with the way his focus was on the Dutch side of trade without understanding the local colonial administration. I will say parenthetically here, I'm indebted to Viviana for telling me all about Dutch colonial administration for the last 20 years or more. And so that started getting into to the historiography of Spanish America, the Rio del Plata. And obviously, this was not what I was thinking when I started out, but got into it. And so heavily indebted to the work of Zacharias Metokias. But again, I wasn't comfortable with the same understanding of contraband in looking at local governance in Spanish America, because from the Dutch point of view, contraband means risk. And the way I saw it was Dutch trade in the 1550s and 60s flowing through Buenos Aires inward and outward was not because necessarily the governors were greedy and corrupt. Those kinds of things would increase risk, but instead because they functioned within a system of government that allowed them to interpret royal will to best serve the local and regional communities. So from that then, I was focusing on contracts and looking at sort of the notarial cultures of Amsterdam and Buenos Aires that were binding these men together, even when they weren't necessarily face-to-face sometimes, and using Martin Wasserman for understanding the Rio de Plata end of things. So that's sort of how I sort of envisioned myself in terms of the historiography. For the what have I learned as an author in engaging in this, two things. One would be the importance of archives, as if we didn't already know that. As this was a project that really began by, well, in part began by just looking for Dutch sounding names at the AGN in Buenos Aires. I had, to be quite honest, been tired of taking pictures for Viviana of documents and wanted to sort of look at something of my own. And then just sort of following the names through the archives. So obviously the AGN, the AGI, the city archives in Amsterdam, but also the Public Record Office in London, the Overseas Archives in France. And it's amazing the kind of following individuals through. Alberto Janssen, 4 different archives in 4 different countries. The same with Isaac de Braak. It's the paper trail is everywhere. The other thing I learned is about the community of historians. Fabricio mentioned this at the beginning, and I think probably at least one, probably 2 chapters were workshopped at the Rio de la Plata. And then just Alex giving me a lowdown on wind and currents in the Atlantic world over coffee, and suddenly some issues made sense. Or Kara Schultz at the Rio de la Plata workshop, talking me through some of the practical issues of slave trade, or even Chris Lane at a Fiji conference, where I came up to him and said, "Hey, I have this idea for a book. What do you think?" So you have all those kinds of connections. I mean, I had a couple of French students who I knew from here at UMKC track down sources in France for me. So that kind of community and community building is sort of so important. There's a Ramklas for Fabrizio and I came talking about the same 18th century merchant, but viewing him in completely different ways. And obviously we probably still don't agree on that one. As far as future plans, my project ends around 1680. As the Dutch centers of trade moved north to Curacao. But I know that there were a handful of Flemish or Dutch merchants or seamen who remained for one reason or another in Buenos Aires. And we have myself, Viviana, and Martin Wasserman trying to make sense of the notarial archives at the AGN, with me again, basically going through looking for Dutch sounding names. And so part of that is continuation of that. And then moving on to some other things, I just finished an essay. That's a collection of essays on the persistence of the Spanish Black legend, and again looking at Dutch in the Spanish world, and very much enjoying straddling these two regions, these 2 worlds, and these 2 groups of people.
Well, thank you very much. We are now moving to our 3rd presenter of the night. Do you want me to read the questions, or you want to go through the questions?
It's up to you. I have them.
You have them? Okay.
Yeah, I have.
I can read them for the audience just in case they forgot about them. They're on the chat for the group that just came in, because we've been in a meeting throughout the entire conference. The questions are on the chat. And so we are on the 3rd presenter of the night, Jeffrey Urbe. And so the first question that we have for tonight is, what has been the major contribution of your book to the historiography of the Rio de la Plata and or the Atlantic?
Well, thank you so much, Viviana. And it's great to see everybody. So many of you have fingerprints on my book in so many different ways. And it's really gratifying to be able to present among all of you. And it's not lost on me that it's Friday evening in some places. So thank you for being here on a Friday evening. And thank you, Sean, for being my hype man. I appreciate the kind introductions or kind comments on my book. So in thinking about how I envision my book contributing to scholarship or historiography of the Rio de la Plata, I think the thing that most stands out is an attempt to consider inter-imperial and inter-ethnic relations in conjunction with one another, beyond folks who may have lived on missions or may have been considered imperial subjects in some way or another. More specifically, what I mean by that is at the corner of the Rio de la Plata that I focus on is an area that would be presently Uruguay, northeastern Argentina, provinces of Entre Rios and Corrientes, and then really the southern half of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And when we think about what sorts of records do we have of this region to focus on, say the 18th century in particular, right? We tend to have sources from coastal or port cities, from towns, whether they be Portuguese in the east and the south, Spanish in the west and the south, and then from that large Jesuit Guarani mission complex in the north. And understandably, most of the scholarship that we have on the region focuses on people moving within those spaces, right? Whether they be via commercial networks to port cities, whether they be folks living on missions, whether they be smugglers moving back and forth. So where my work fits in is I think about people who were beyond the reach of colonial control, particularly autonomous indigenous peoples, folks who appear in sources by such ethnic identifiers as charruas or as minuanos, and who were not subject to mission authority, were not subject to Spanish nor Portuguese authority, and really trying to center them in thinking about the region. So I'm not the only one to do this sort of stuff in Southern South America. I think I see my work as part of a growing body of scholarship that is trying to imagine in our context, Southern South America really as native ground. So rather than thinking about autonomous native peoples as an opposite side of a colonial frontier or as within colonial spaces, rather thinking about colonial settlements, whether they be forts, missions, coastal cities or whatever, as enclaves within a broader native worlds that were tethered together by fragile riverways or roadways and so on. So the question is, the challenge is, well, how do we read about tierra adentro, right, the space beyond colonial control, from the lettered city? And I try to get at different answers to that in the book. I think the thing that probably stands out most to readers is the use of geographic information systems as a means to not map native peoples, but to read archives of information, to highlight how the spatial assumptions of our historiographical claims, to highlight the spatial assumptions and sources, and then to read against that. Within that broader kind of rereading and trying to focus on native grounds, my work pushes back on narratives of native disappearance, particularly in all of the spaces I discussed, but acutely in Uruguay. That long-standing notion of Uruguay as a país sin indios, but really trying to push back on that and building upon work of present-day social movements and charrua activists who've been doing the same thing. I think my work does that in bringing to light campaigns in captive taking on the part of the Spanish in particular to think about native peoples as they move to Buenos Aires or Montevideo, right? So not just as rural agents, but also within these cities. And then to distinguish discursive disappearance of native peoples and sources from the disappearance of people as such. On a broader Atlantic world scale, much of the same thing, right? Tethering stories of autonomous native peoples to the Atlantic world via trade networks or via debates over land possession or blockades of internal spaces, things of that nature. So I think those are some of the principal contributions.
Thank you so much. For the second question, what have you learned as an author and scholar from engaging in the research for this book?
How much time do we have? I have 5 minutes, right?
Yes.
So this was a project that built for me upon questions I've been looking at for a long time. And this project specifically was at one moment in time a dissertation. So it was my research for this was very formative, not only in the way that I thought about the colonial Rio de la Plata, but also the way I think about history broadly or society broadly. So in terms of things that I learned, so the first obvious one is that I learned a lot about the region and how to think about the region in connection to other spaces. Coming from North American academia, right? much of the theorization that we have, or much of the historiography that we have, draws upon English language contexts, or in the case of Latin America, Mesoamerica, and the Andes, right? This is no secret. And I found that much of that was very limited in terms of explanatory and how it was able to explain the things that I was seeing. So I learned a lot to try to, I learned to be omnivorous in reading and connect that with a lot with debates that are happening in Brazil and debates that are happening in Argentina, right? This is basic stuff, but I think, for example, to be more concrete about it, things like history of cartography is something that informs my work. And much of the theorization of power in history of cartography comes from British colonial world, right? So South Asia or North America and subaltern studies that I think overstates colonial power in the spaces that I'm looking at. I think that North American studies on ethnicity tend to be much more rigid than studies of ethnicity that been coming out of Brazil or Argentina, and thinking about ethnogenesis and ethnification and things of that nature. So I've learned to really read across all of these literatures. If anybody picks up my book, they'll see that a third of it is bibliography, and that's in part why. I was really trying to connect those things. The second thing that I'll say that I learned is how, and I became acutely aware of how archives shape our spatial imaginaries. I think we're probably all well versed in thinking about how archives create grains and to read against archival grains or along archival grains to identify silences in archives, yada, yada, yada. But I think we're often much less attuned, or we're much more willing to take at face value the spatial messages of sources we have, whether that's in the content of a source, whether it's in the way that archival collections are cataloged and curated and structured, what is transcribed and what is not, or the institutions that we go to. So in this particular region, right, those of us who are working on the 18th century or the late 17th and early 19th century as well, we tend to go to state archives, whether it be national archives or imperial archives or state and provincial archives in that regard. And each of these archives tend to be structured around either colonial jurisdictions or post-colonial national spaces or subnational spaces. When we think about archives being founded in the 19th century, much of the purpose of that was to create a national narrative of territorial realization. So we have to be really, I've learned to be very much aware of the spatial claims coming through, not only in the content of the sources, but in their structure, when thinking about people whose lives ran counter to that. The final thing that I'll say is I learned the need for collaboration. Right. So as Sean was indicating, my research took me to a lot of places, 27 archives in 7 countries. Right? That is not a sustainable way to be researching, or an expectation that everybody should have. It's just not possible. And it wouldn't have been possible in my case if it weren't for the support of many of the folks here. Right. I think about Fabrizio in particular, right, sharing so many digitized documents, or Alex pointing me to particular collections, and others who are here as well. And I think that we've done a great job of doing this informally. I wonder, and I think a lot about if there are more formal ways we can do that, not only among academics, but with community members and the public as well, right? So for me, mine was not a collaborative project, but through it, I developed relationships with present-day Charrua communities and activists, and learned a lot from them, and learned to think about my work in a different way in that regard. Not to say that every project should be that way, but I wonder if we might think about ways of doing that more, and that's something that's on my mind in my own work in particular.
Thank you. So for the third question, what scholarly plans do you have for the future? Do you plan to use this book as the platform for future research? Do you plan to depart from this type of work or region?
So one of the things that was kind of, we all have those lingering questions that we don't feel like we really answered as well as we wanted to in our book. For me, one of the things that I hoped that I'd be able to do more in the book that really didn't happen to the degree that I'd hoped was to follow captives as they moved away from the countryside, right? So there's a lot of documentation about colonial era raids, and for that matter, in the case of Uruguay, national context raids against Native communities, and the taking of captives away from the countryside. And I was able in the book to connect some of these cases to people arriving in Buenos Aires or Montevideo or elsewhere, building upon the work of people like Susana Aguirre and others who did some of that documentation. Particularly, we have more records of that in the case of women and of children who were taken to holding centers and then tended to be distributed among elite families. But I wasn't able to track people who would be marked as men in the sources who were taken into captivity. Right? The few references I have talked about, for example, I believe it was 1831 in Uruguay, chief of police saying, well, we have all of these Charrúa captives in our prison. We can offer them to ship captains on the condition that they never return to this national space. And I thought, wow, that's interesting, but I didn't really know what to do with that. Who are these captains? Where are they going? And then about 2 years ago, it's entirely random, my mother-in-law, who lives in Buenos Aires and is very Peronist and very interested in national history and all that sort of stuff, she was asking me if there were indigenous participants in the Malvinas War in the 1980s, or if there were people who were indigenous to the Malvinas Islands. And I knew a little bit, but not a whole lot. So I thought, why don't I start looking into it? So as I start looking, Googling or looking, through bibliographies and otherwise, I came across this case, I believe it was 1834, of an uprising against the British governor there, and that the main participants in the uprising were Charrúas. What are Charrúas doing in Malvinas? How did they get there? And what is this all about? And as I started digging into this more, I saw more and more cases, and as I've gone now through the legajos of Malvinas in Argentina's National Archive, finding more cases of indigenous folks being taken captive from the Pampas or otherwise taken to Malvinas or taken to Martin Garcia, or in the case of Chile, taken to Juan Fernandez Islands. And there's this broader pattern that's going on. So in my new project, what I'm looking at really is the colonial era practice of banishment, what we would call in Spanish destierro, or in Portuguese degredo. There's been a lot written about this, in particular in terms of banishment outward from Spain and Portugal to Portuguese global spaces or Spanish global spaces, or from Mexico City to the Philippines along the Pacific galleons. But there's very little in South America. The work that exists tends to focus on these sort of studies of criminality and of labor. I'm more interested in thinking about it in terms of colonization, settler colonialism in space, right? So how is it that indigenous captives became presidiarios or desterrados in all of these far-flung forts? How do we think about the crisscrossing paths of indigenous captives and purported imperial criminals? So it's new. I don't know where it's going to take me. I've found some stuff, hoping to find more when I can kind of get back out there. But that's the direction I'm going. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jeffrey, for your presentation. Thank you, David. Thank you, Sean. We are now open for Q&A, and we would like to get the Q&A organized through the chat. So we welcome questions through the chat, and then we will read them for the authors. So go ahead and let us know what questions you have.
If anyone wants to use the raise hand function, that is available as well, and we can. But we have Guillaume or Sean Austin. Guillaume, would you like to go ahead and read your question, or just speak it out loud? So
if it's possible. Thank you, everyone. This is a great event. I'm very happy to see you online from Aberystwyth, Wales. So yeah, my question is, I'm interested from one of the sentences of the cover back of your book, Sean, and I would like to please develop the idea of Guaranis forcing Spaniards to marry their daughter or their sister. I would like, please, and just another, maybe if I may, if I can, another problem I think of in the book, Sean, and would like to talk about the sources. And I would like to ask you if you went during your PhD to Seville, to the Archivo General de Indias, because you have a lot of source, and you said that there is no Bartolomé de las Casas in Paraguay, but I wrote a book in 2018 around the defense of the Guarani by a priest during the 16th century. And in 2019, I wrote a chapter entitled Influences of the Lascasian Discourse in Paraguay, 16th century, the itinerary of Martin Gonzalez, in a chapter in a Brill edition. Thank you.
Go ahead, Sean.
Okay. Well, I should probably note the miracle it is that we finished on time. 3 scholars finished on time. That should be noted at the outset. So Guillaume, hi, good to see you. Couple of questions there. The first question hovers around this idea of the power of kinship. I mean, it's not a secret that Spaniards were struggling when they arrived in Paraguay, that they were completely dependent upon indigenous peoples. And this is the context. I trace in my first chapter the idea that Spaniards are drawing on the examples of interethnic kinship, of the Tovaja relationship from the outset, even before they arrive in Asuncion. And so they have this example from Brazil, they have this example from the islands, and they know that this is a way in which you can achieve some sort of acquire provisions through the Guarani. And so when Spaniards arrive in Asuncion and they begin creating these networks and relationships with Guarani, albeit through violence, albeit through coercion, or albeit through absolute necessity, right? They're engaging in a cultural system whereby kinship is the primary means of exchanging anything. And so the Guarani have no word for trade. The word for trade in Guarani is tepu, vengeance. So the systems of contact are so different. And it makes sense for Spaniards to accept Guarani women and then use them as servants. So this is the way that Guarani exchange with Spaniard. There's no other way of doing it. And what my history does is show the process of the construction of that new colonial system, Cuñadasco. As to your question, Guillaume, about not citing your book, I'm sorry. I've explained this to you in a previous email. When you are writing a book, you kind of put things to bed after you're done writing that chapter, and you have to move on to the next chapter. The production cycle for a publication of a book is extremely lengthy. And so it's a slip in my scholarship that your book didn't appear in my book. And I'm really excited to engage with it in the next round of publications that I'll be doing. In terms of the archives, as you'll see in the book, right, I did visit the archives in Seville. I was focused in that visit, my limited time as a PhD student, in that visit to the archive, to the sources that dealt with the visitas and the specific sources that I had previously identified, in which you have visitadores going in and conducting censuses of Guarani peoples. And so those were the focus of those visits. And so, yeah, there are a number of letters, especially from Martin Gonzalez, who you heroically translated and you have, or transcribed and have available in your book. If I want to engage directly with those letters, Guillaume, I mean, I think that we can have a conversation about the complicated nature of those letters and the complicated role that Martin Gonzalez played in that society. There's a vast body of scholarship that shows that a Las Casian understanding of interethnic relationships, right? It needs to be complicated, and so my book, I hope my book is doing that. But always, in any project you're going to have sources that are left out, and if that's a fault of mine, then that's a fault of mine, and I'll suffer the consequences that for those in those published reviews that will come out. So.
All right, we have Alex, and then after Alex, we'll have Julia Sarreal and Zacarias Mutuquias.
Thank you, Fabricio, and thank you for all the three for being very succinct in your presentations and very informative, as well for some of you who may have read the book, but some of you who may not have read the books. I have two questions, one from David and another for Jeff. My question for David, that it's on his book, but also on the work that he's doing with other people, moving on what was going on with the Dutch later, after the ending of this Dutch trade in the later part of the 17th century, is to what degree these Dutch sources reflect or not what the Portuguese were doing in the region at that time. To what degree these notary sources that you have seen in the Netherlands, and to what degree their counterparts in the Rio de la Plata can illuminate us in that kind of black hole that is for the Luso-Spanish relationship in the Rio de la Plata, that period between, let's say, 1640 and the founding of Colonia de Sacramento in 1680, which sometimes escape for people doing that research, both from Buenos Aires and people doing that kind of research from Brazil. That's my question for you, David. And for Jeff, I'm very happy you are going to the 19th century. That's great. And it didn't surprise to me that there were charruas in the Malvinas in the 1830s, to tell you the truth, but it was a good, like, ha-ha. The issue on these kind of coerced systems of migrations and how they evolved from the late colonial period on the Spanish to the early republics, at least I know a colleague that is working on the late colonial period, Jesse Conwell, I'm pronouncing right his name, right? In Mississippi. I'm very intrigued if you can tell us a little bit more of your ongoing work, particularly because once we see these indigenous people taken as captives in Montevideo, it's like they disappear. That it's a kind of this new narrative of disappearance, that they are there, but unless the police are not trying to recapture them or bring them back to the house in which they were living, they were coerced labor in that house, mostly women and children, they are very hard to grasp in the historical record. And I assume something like that may have happened also as well in Buenos Aires. Thank you. Those are my questions. And you can go first, Dave.
All right. So as far as Portuguese sources and Dutch archives, which I think was what you were asking, that one?
Or the mentions of the Portuguese that the Dutch do.
Well, it's obviously complicated after 1640, and complicated in terms of the relationship still between the Dutch and the remnants of what they have in Brazil. you know, when you're in an archive and skimming through things, there's the stuff that you look at, and then there's the stuff you wish you had time to look at. What the stuff I wish I had time to look at in Amsterdam was every once in a while there'd be obviously Sephardic Jewish merchants in Amsterdam with contacts in Brazil. When they would sort of pop up, I would think, ooh, that's interesting. I've only got, 2 more months here. And the Notary Archive there is not well organized, and so it is flip through and good luck. But more broadly, the 1640s is still sort of complicated because there still is the death knell of the West India Company. And their attempts to try to keep going even as they're losing. And for that, there's a lot of sort of back and forth over, I mean, it turns into a, do we want trade or do we want Brazil? And I think in the end, especially as you get into the later 1640s, it's a decision that Lisbon is worth it, and better Lisbon now than maybe Brazil later. If that sort of answers your question, there's work there to do, and I wish I had time to have done that, but sort of there you go. Story of a historian's life.
All right. So thank you, Alex, for your questions. So yeah, just a temper, I'm not going to go that far into the 19th century. Don't get too excited. It's a whole nother world that archivally that can be a challenge. To your question about this narrative of Charrua disappearance, right? In listening to your question, also reminded me how we're often working with the same sources. Like when you're narrating these cases of police records, it's like, oh, I know what source you're talking about, right? Because we're working from this very limited corpus, as you very well emphasize. I think the thing that's important another way of phrasing what you described is that ethnicity, with the exception, I think in large part of Guarani and the missions, tended to be in terms of sources, ethnic labels tended to appear for people who were beyond colonial control, right? So to be Charrua or to be Minuano, right? By and large, and this is not universal, but by and large meant to be associated with the tolderia, meaning to be outside of this umbrella of colonial authority. And when folks moved into those colonial spaces, whether as captives or because of some sort of kinship ties or some sort of labor relations, they tended to be more racialized in the terms that were applied to them, right? So they become indios or they become chinas. So in that sense, and they're often, if they're captives, they're often baptized and given a Christian name, right? So there are lots of Marias who appear in the sources, as you can imagine. So it's really, really, really hard. Some of the things that I tried to do was, so in the case of Buenos Aires, right, the former Jesuit residence, the Casa de la Reclusión, was used as a holding center for indigenous captives, not just Charruas and Minuanes, but also for Pampas or people who are labeled Pampas, other folks from that region. In the case of the Pampas region, it was often to hold people and then ransom them to their kin in different sorts of negotiations. In the case of Charruas and Minuanes, it was a means of exile, right, to remove them from their land. So it's really, really tricky and really, really hard. Part of the reason that I am focusing particularly now on captives who were identified as male or as men is because I think there's a different archive that hasn't been as deeply explored for them, because what they become are, as I said, presidiarios or desterrados. And I think I've done this a little bit. I think, like I said, I found cases in Malvinas, working with a wonderful research assistant, Victoria Wolfman, who is, I think, connected here, finding cases in Martin Garcia, Avipones, and Malvinas, other folks from the Pampas and Martin Garcia and otherwise. As far as the question of disappearance, I don't know that the archive is going to give us an answer to say, okay, well, here they all are. We found them. I think what we need to do is be very clear to distinguish discursive disappearance from the disappearance of people as such, right? And I think that's where I think my work bridges with a lot of sort of the oral history work that's going on presently in Uruguay or in Entre Rios among Charrúa, people who claim Charrúa identity in their communities, to talk about these family histories. And I think from there, we might be able to work backwards genealogically. I don't know that there's really a way to say, like, okay, here are all the sources we're going to find them. Like, I tried thinking about, well, who were servants in these elite families who were claiming them? And it was even hard to do it that way. So I'm not optimistic about the archival record being the answer to that question, at least in the case of captives within cities. But I think we need to acknowledge that the archive is occluding something that is going on.
Thank you, Billy. And just we have a queue that's a bit long. So we have Julia, Billy, Zacarias, Fabio, Adriano, Mariana, and Denise, right? So go ahead, Julia, if you want to read your question.
Sure. Hi, my question is for Sean. So I am curious about how much control over and access to firearms the Guarani had within the context of the mission and the Jesuits' control.
Hi, Julia. Thanks for coming today. Yeah, so in the book I write about the militias in the Asuncion context, and I don't have any evidence that they possessed firearms. Of course, in the Jesuit context, we have the firearms. I still have a long way to go in teasing out that question, but what I've gleaned so far is that on paper and legally, the Jesuits are supposed to be in control. And there's actually a Spanish official who's the sort of intermediary to ensure that that's taking place. But in a report that was filed from Buenos Aires about the militia from Yapeyú, who goes out in 1650s, I think. They go out and they take a Paulista raid, and they find that this raid has already had success, and it has 3 coffles, right? 3 chains of 30 sort of spaces within the chain each. In that expedition, I don't see any mentions of the Jesuits in control of distributing the arms. That might just be because it wasn't brought up. But when you see these things happening on the fly, right, and with the reality that there were not Jesuits in every single reducción in every moment, it leaves open the possibility that they are in control. You also have other arms, right? The ondas and the bow and arrow, and these are being used regularly, right? And so, again, what's the difference between the firearms and the other arms that they're using? So that's kind of where I'm headed. My guess is that they weren't always in control, and that there was this opportunity. But I think the Jesuits also tried to be pretty careful, right? They were on thin ice. And so it was a tricky.
I can also partially answer that question, because it was Dutch merchants that were supplying the firearms to the Jesuits.
I was going to ask you this, David, this particular question. We need to talk, because I know that the Dutch are providing the weapons in North America, and a lot of firearms, right, got into the hands of Native peoples.
Right.
So I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Sure.
I have to unmute myself. we're going to continue the order of the chat. And just remind everybody that you can ask the question in Portuguese, English, Spanish, and if necessary, we can provide on live translation here for the authors. So now we have Billy, and then we follow Zacharias.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much to all three of you. This is a question that kind of takes a step back from the specifics of each project. And I wanted to follow up a bit on Jeff Erbig's point about the scope of research that goes into your books. I think, Jeff, you mentioned 27 archives across 7 countries, if I got that right. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk really briefly about how you did the work that is sort of the nuts and bolts pieces of this. These are multi-year projects, obviously. And I'm wondering too, if you would change things about how you go about doing research in the future, thinking about sustainability and practicality, and not to rain on the book slam celebration we have, but I mean, the precarious point that we're at right now in higher education and thinking about the future of writing books like the books we write.
Whoever wants to step into that, Jeff, maybe?
Sure, and I'll try to keep it short. I see there's a long list of questions, many directed toward me coming down the line. So I'll try to keep it short, and if we don't get through all these other ones, folks can feel free to contact me as well. I'll be happy to follow up offline if we run out of time. So, I mean, first, I want to be clear that the reason that I went to so many places was not to accumulate more information, right? And that, like, when I went to 7 archives, so now I have more information than 6 in sort of some sort of positivistic type sense. But rather, it was a response to the fact that the people who I was most interested in following, records about them have been dispersed broadly and fragmented by effect of this being a borderland space, by the effect of all the sort of divisions, by the effect of their own mobility. So it was more a response to a particular predicament than sort of an accumulation of knowledge, we'll say. So the question was, you know, the nuts and bolts of it, what would you do differently? I would also be clear that I was more ethnographic in some places than I was in others, right? I was, or I don't remember the exact number, many, many months in Buenos Aires. I was many, many months in Rio de Janeiro. I was many months in Montevideo. Those tend to be the 3 main places, and out from there I worked to these other sites. If I could do it differently, I don't think that I would go to less places. If I were rewriting this same project, I think I would have sought out relationships with present-day Charrúa communities earlier on in the project than I did. And just because I think that might have helped me think about present-day connections in a different sort of way. There are other things I can say, but I want to give the other folks a chance to talk.
I'll just chime in real quick, David. I really don't have much to add. I think Jeff's project really elucidates these problems more than mine. So I would just agree with everything he said. I really don't have much to add to that problem. I don't have a good solution for getting around closures of archives, except to note that we have a lot more stuff available online today. The work of the Paraguayanist archives is incredible. They've put it all online. And so, you know, I can access all the documents that I brought home the 70 gigs of photos that I brought home in my hard drive are now available through our archives. So this is something that we're going to continue to see. I think that will, help us circumvent some of these problems, William, that you pose.
Yeah, I think one of the things from this COVID era is that a lot of archives are thinking about how they digitalize things and make that available in different ways that I think that they maybe would not have thought of had they not had to close.
All right. Zacarías.
Sí, hola, buenas noches, porque aquí es la noche todo. bueno, primero gracias a los organizadores por el taller en línea y gracias a los autores que han presentado, muy interesante y muy interesante sus trabajos. Tengo dos preguntas, una para John Austin y otro para David Freeman. Otra pregunta, perdón. John, ¿tú me entiendes el castellano? John. Sí, ok. Entonces la pregunta, bueno, no he leído el libro, pero me resultó muy interesante y seguramente en cuanto llegue a la biblioteca de la Sorbona lo voy a leer. La pregunta es si entendí bien esta idea tuya del cuñadazgo. ¿Cómo dialoga este aspecto? Es una forma de alianza. Lo que estás diciendo, me parece, es que las formas guaraníes de parentesco afectan a las formas castellanas de parentesco. Este sería el argumento. Entonces, mi pregunta es cómo dialoga esto con el sistema de herencia luso-castellano, en el sentido de la transmisión igualitaria hacia hombres y mujeres de en cualquier orden de nacimiento. No hay ni familia troncal, ni prioridad al primogénito. Esta sería. Y para David Freeman, ¿tú entiendes castellano,
Sí.
David? Ok. Entonces, ha habido los últimos 15 años, diría, una rediscusión, se retomó, se desarrolló la discusión sobre la corrupción. Ha habido un artículo muy interesante de Garriga, que es uno de los grandes personajes de la historia del derecho española, que critica la manera como la corrupción, concepto de corrupción se utiliza. Me parece que ha sido una respuesta a un gran coloquio que hubo en el 2017 organizado por, ¿cómo se llama esta mujer? Ponce Leiva y Francisco Andújar en la Universidad Complutense, que además sacaron un libro sobre corrupción y servicio, el tema de la actividad empresaria de los administradores y el servicio al rey, el servicio y la recompensa, el mérito y la gracia, todas estas figuras que están tan vinculadas a la corrupción. Bueno, y luego también Pichman, también retomando las viejas ideas de Van Claveren, sacó algunos artículos, creo que en México. Bueno, ha habido algo que podemos decirse, no es que ha dialogado entre ellos, pero sí son diferentes puntos de vista sobre el tema de la corrupción. Entonces me gustaría saber cómo tú te sitúas en relación a esos diferentes puntos de vista. Esto.
Bueno, empiezo yo entonces. No, Zacarías, gracias por la pregunta. Una alianza no creo que sea tan simple como una alianza. El cuñadazgo es más bien una relación, un sistema de relaciones entre los dos gentes que llega a ser agregado y impuesto sobre la encomienda, ¿verdad? Una alianza quiere decir que tenemos un acuerdo entre los españoles en sí y los guaraníes en sí, y no creo que la política guaraní era tan bastante grande para abarcar una alianza general. Entonces, sí puede ser una alianza entre un conquistador y un tobajá, pero no una alianza de modo general.
Perdóname, me refería a alianza no en el sentido de alianza política, sino alianza en el sentido que un matrimonio es una alianza, en el sentido de parentesco, no de una alianza política.
Puede ser. el base de esa alianza entonces sería la reciprocidad. Los guaraníes esperaban herramientas, cuñas, cuñas y cuchillos y anillos, todo tipo de, esos instrumentos. Y aún los españoles se dijeron entre sí que el mejor encomendero fuera el que lo diera lo más cuñas a su pueblo, a su encomienda. Y bueno, entonces, en cuanto a la herencia, no creo que fue tan profundo el cambio de la cultura española, el impacto del cuñadazgo. No impactó legalmente cómo se heredía entre los españoles. Pero sí puedo decir que cuando los españoles contaron a los guaraní y siguieron el linaje de los guaraní, siguieron los madres, porque fueron los madres que se movían entre los pueblos. Entonces, cuando los gobernadores querían marcar una mujer de un encomendero al otro, siguieron el linaje de la madre, no de la padre. Entonces, es al revés del seguir el del padre.
So my Spanish ear is better than my Spanish mouth, so I'll have to respond in English. And thanks for the question. And this is something that I talked to Christoph Rosenmuller about, and really, at least for my work, sort of didn't want to go so much in that direction. The historiography of it is very rich. I love Riga, but it's not something I was going to focus on. And in some instances, it seems to me that it kind of runs itself in circles, and especially that it places too much emphasis on empire, less on the kind of local interactions that are much more contextual, if that makes sense. And so what I wanted to focus on was governance, not on administration. So, I mean, I respect their contributions, but I wanted to provide another angle by focusing on actions. And again, this is something in the community of talking to Christoph that sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree.
Okay.
I'm muted. So we have Fabio, Adriano, Mariana, Denise, and Sean again. Fabio, if you want to ask your question.
Hi, Fabricio. Hi, everybody. It's a very, very nice meeting here. And I have a question to Jeffrey. I didn't read all your book, but I want to know something that is, I'm trying to research too, beginning this research now. And you talk about the obstacles that the indigenous people brought to the Iberian map makers. But I'm asking you something little different. Did you perceive some collaboration? Did you perceive something of the indigenous knowledge in the maps that these map makers made? It's this, basically it's this. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, everybody.
So thank you so much, Fabio. Very nice to see you. I feel that we go different years to the seminar, so I haven't gotten to meet you in person. It's very nice to see you now. That's a great question. I think the answer depends upon who we mean when we're talking about indigenous people, right? So when I started this project, right, I've been reading other works about these boundary commissions in other parts of the Americas, right? Maria de Fatima Costa and other folks who have been writing about indigenous peoples serving as guides, providing food, sharing knowledge, other sorts of things. In the particular context, spatial context that I've looked at, indigenous collaborators, if we might call them that, were by and large Guarani-speaking folks from the missions, right, who did many things, right? Looked at the guide maps that the treaty makers were walking with and corrected them, right? Said, no, this river's not called this, it's called this. Or, all aside from the material support that they provided. We have examples in Paraguay. Felix de Azara, famous Portuguese commissary, goes and he meets, it's facilitated by a priest, he meets several indigenous, they were Mbaya caciques, who present what sounds to me like a quipu, right? So it's a knotted device that they talk about to relate things. But when we talk about charruas or minuanos, I was hoping to find the same thing, and I never did. The relationships were very different. The relationships with the boundary commissions, right, were ones, antagonistic isn't the right word, but they were, in my mind, exerting their own control over this space, right? So we see things, for example, in San Ildefonso mapping expeditions, both the Portuguese, the Spanish teams, when they go through this area, right, they're drawing their own maps, they're declaring territorial possession for the respective crowns. They're declaring or imagining sovereignty over peoples within those spaces. Yet at the same time, they're offering payments to many different indigenous peoples along the way, and they're being stopped, and they're writing in their things, oh yeah, we were taxed, right? So to me, to read that source, I say, okay, well, there's a contradiction going on here, from which we can read that the interaction is one of, an exertion of authority. Now, your question was more about collaboration. So I think where we can see more coordination is following the mapping expeditions, right? Many of these the officials of the boundary expeditions then transition into these other roles, right? Trying to found settlements along where the imaginary border would have run, trying to advise viceroys over what to do with that space. And it's there where we can see, not necessarily with the same individuals, but we can see indigenous, at the very least, leaders, and I would suggest not only caciques, but polderias affiliated with them, simultaneously participating in the formation and the undermining of the border, right? So signing pacts with Spanish in the Fort of Santa Tecla to patrol the border, right? And apprehend people traveling through it. Well, to me, that is an effort or that is something that materializes the border as a meaningful thing. Yet those same caciques meeting with Portuguese traders and guiding them secretly across the borderline to extract livestock from there. Right, so they're engaging it in different sorts of ways. In terms of what we can see in maps, what I tend to read in the maps of the boundary commissions, there's other works that I've done on other things, is we can read the silences. One of the things to me that's remarkable about the maps that they have is there are these big, like, blank spaces, right? They're so detailed in the spaces they go through. And if you look at the blank spaces, which they sometimes try to cover up with a cartouche or otherwise, these are the exact same spaces that they really don't have access to because of other native peoples there. So we can read, rather than via those, those free-floating ethnonyms that we see labeled on maps, I think what we can see more readily is knowing how to read the silences is more of my strategy. So collaboration, perhaps not as much as we hope, but presence for sure.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Good question.
Thank you, guys. This is going great. Thank you so much. So just to be clear here, we're going to go over all the questions on the chat. We understand that we may go beyond the time, and then whoever needs to leave is great, but we're going to keep going as far as there's people in the room. Authors, I'm sorry to indicate this, we made an executive decision here. So the list goes. We have Adriano, Mariana, Denise, and Sean with questions. Adriano, go ahead. The floor is yours. You need to unmute yourself.
Also, if it's easier, I can just, they're all in the chat. I'd be happy to just answer. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Thanks, Fabricio. This is a wonderful session, and I have a question for Jeffrey. First, I have to confess I didn't read your book, but I want to know if you did came across reports of intelligence gathering, information gathering, or even espionage action during your research. Or in other words, how much each imperial agents were engaged in surveillance over the others, Spanish over Portuguese, Portuguese over Spanish. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Rather than, there's more examples than I would make sense to list now. I definitely, yes, there's definitely attempts at intelligence gathering, particularly around Colonia do Sacramento, right? Because for the Spanish, right, as Fabricio could tell you better than I could, right? They didn't want Colonia there, and for the Portuguese, it was very important for Colonia to consider to exist. What I would add to that, so we see things, for example, Portuguese officials who are in Colonia making pacts with Minuanos to try to patrol the coastline, right? Into requesting or trying to make deals so that the Minuanos would report foreign ships that moved within the harbor of Montevideo before Montevideo was founded as a city, or Maldonado, or Castillo Grande, right? So you trying to move into relationships to patrol, and then to try to incentivize the Minuanos to not let the French or anybody else establish something similar to a Victoria or some sort of trading post in those spaces. So I think the best way I could answer is yes, there are many examples. The thing that I try to emphasize in the book is that both Spain and Portugal relied on indigenous agents for information and for surveilling the countryside. So there are instances in which Spanish officials try to perform sovereignty by sending troops to surveil the countryside. And then when you read the reports from the troops, every time they saw smoke in the horizon, they hid, right? Because they didn't have effective authority over that space. So we can see a lot of that, and that was a means, that inter-imperial dispute prior to the invention of a borderline was a means for Tonderias in those spaces to leverage one empire against the other. And then following the drawing of the border, I would argue that in that borderland space near this purported borderline, similar opportunities emerged. So I would again emphasize the centrality of these Tonderias to that narrative.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. And now, Mariana, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, thank you all for sharing your work with us. This is a short question for Jeff about your new project. I was wondering what the geographical scope is, what you're thinking about, whether you're still working on charruas or if you're moving, and which states you're interested in, like if you're working in the context of colonialism or the 19th century, which we kind of said like not so much. And then more importantly, you mentioned something about the historiography and how it's more focused on labor and you're more interested in space. And I was wondering if you could expand on what you think about the current literature.
Thank you so much, and nice to see you as well. So, you know, I have a bad habit of overstretching myself. So when I initially conceived this project, and I was like, oh, well, I'm just going to do Spanish colonial worlds and Portuguese colonial worlds at the same time, everywhere. Why not? Right? And then it was, well, you know, I'll focus on the Americas. And now it's increasingly more going back to things that in part because of the issue that Billy raised, like what I can work from, thinking about lowland South America, so thinking about Brazil, or what's presently Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, but also Chile. So I'm going to just start from the south and move northward. But it is an enormous endeavor even in that regard, right? I'm attracted to projects that force me to pull together things from many different places and read them together. So I think it's shared in that regard. Whether that will pertain a lot to charruas, it depends upon what I find. I think what I'm expecting to find is much more information about other folks who were taken to Montevideo in particular than Charruas, but who knows? And then on the literature, I should clarify that I really see two literatures that I'm drawing upon so far in this project that are not in conversation with one another, right? On the one hand, there's what I mentioned, right? There's a lot of these studies of deportation regimes, deportation not in terms of political deportation and exile, but rather as an antecedent to prison penitentiaries, right? And as an antecedent to that. But they tend to focus on because they're looking at criminal case files, the story tends to end with folks being exiled somewhere else. Or in the case of folks like Timothy Coates, right, who are taking this broader Portuguese global world, but really focusing people going out from Lisboa to other parts of the world. And then the colonial part of penal colonization, in my mind, really gets left out by and large, right? There's this assumption that, well, folks are sent out and then they're an unfree labor force, which is true. So I'm going to leave that to one side for a moment. The other side, there's a growing body of literature on indigenous captivity. Alex was referring to some of this as well, and exile. So I think, for example, I'm blanking on names. Conrad, his first name will come to me. But lots of writing, for example, about Apache captives being taken from what's presently Texas and sent to Cuba, right? Or in new folks from what's now like Quebec and New France taken to the Caribbean, or from what's presently New England to the Caribbean. And there's a lot of studies, Nancy Van Dusen's recent work, about indigenous people being taken to all different places. What I hope to do is to bring the logics of those two works together to think about why is it that the rise in both of this is occurring alongside the invention of borders and attempts to, this late 18th century attempt, which really escalates in the 19th century, to create territorialized spaces of government. And my hunch, this is not, this is borne out somewhat, but I've only done a little bit of work, is that a lot of it has to do with not only labor in borderland spaces, but legal geographies. So there's sort of biopolitical logics about putting bodies in spaces as a means to make claims, right? Along the border between that I studied in my first project, right? There's Sorianos from the Azores, there's Canary Islanders who are sent there, but then there's also these debates among Portuguese and Spanish officials about, well, what if we send Guarani settlers there, right? Could they be seen as settlers to have the same claim, right? There's a racialized logic that undergirds that, I believe. So those are the types of things that I'm trying to think about by bringing those things together. I'm still at an initial point where it's just kind of trying to get a sense of flows and movement of people, but in thinking about it conceptually, that's where I'm trying to go.
All right, I think that we continue with Jeff on the hot seat with the questions from Denise and later Sean. Is Denise still arriving?
Hello. Hello, everybody. It's a nice experience to be here. Congratulations to the organizers for the new format of the event, and especially congratulations for the authors and for so fantastic books. My two questions I wrote in the chat is to Jeff. And these two questions I inspired not only in the book, I just finished to read the book and I made a review, but I'm following some articles, the last articles that you wrote. My two questions is about ethnonyms. I used in my current research, the ethnonyms was very useful for me. And I agree in some aspects with the critiques that you do in the book. So my question is, do you agree that only by ethnonymus the scholars take advantage of the data and do dialogue with unavoidable fields for who work with indigenous histories, such as archaeology, anthropology, and ethnology? The second question is, to what extent terminologies such as cacicazgos, tolderias, partialities are accurate to refer to holistic and collective social organizations? Because for me, sounds, for example, cacicazgo sounds me individual, tolderias sound me economic. This is my two questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise. Nice to see you again. I always appreciate your comments. So, and think about these two questions together, right? It sounds like the broader thing we're thinking about is, well, what language can we use to talk about, right, Native peoples via colonial sources, right? So can we use ethnonyms, as I've, along with others, have critiqued a fair amount, and are these other terms that I and others tend to use instead more useful, right? It sounds like that's really the question at hand. I would answer in this way. One, I still use ethnonyms as they appear in sources. So in my book, you'll see a lot charruas, minuanos, quenoas, sharos, boanes, because I can't be sure what they meant, and it's possible that there was meaning. The way I think about it is less about what is more or less accurate. I think about it as what work do the different terms do, and how have they been used over time. And I think that's also very context specific, right? So in North American scholarship, for example, right, the meaning of ethnic identities is very important, particularly once you get in a national context, because there are treaties made between the U.S. government and particular Native polities that are harkened back to today, right? So my claim is not a universal claim. The issue that I tend to find with ethnic labels is that they are used often in the context that I study to agglutinate or to pull together diverse peoples who really didn't have a lot to do with one another, that they tend to be based upon territorialized logic. So when we think about what the logic is for using an ethnonym as it appears in a source, right, the logic deployed by writers had to do with territorial location, had to do generally with some perceived shared linguistic category, and then later on having to do with particular racialized notions of, are these people mobile or are they not? Can they be allies? Can they not? And these inevitably has led to narratives of Native disappearance as these terms have changed over time, either via ethnogenesis or via ethnicization or otherwise. So I tend to be skeptical about their significance for Native peoples themselves for the precise reasons that you point to, that they don't necessarily replicate what we might imagine social organization to be. So the other part of the question is like, okay, well, what about cacicazgos, tonderías, parcialidades, et cetera, et cetera? Of those terms, the only one that I tend to use is tonderías, because as you said, cacicazgo tends to focus on a particular individual, though I do use the term cacique, right? So in using the term cacique, the reason I use that is to emphasize what was visible in colonial sources, right? When we think about what information existed about a particular community, in the source, we might have an ethnonym. We'll generally have the term tolderias, and we'll generally have, or sometimes have the name of a cacique or a group of caciques. So these are our options. So sometimes I do use cacique as proxy, though I try to be transparent about the fact that we don't know whether that relates to a particular community. We don't know whether that cacique was a leader of the community or merely a representative, intermediary between the Spanish or the Portuguese or missionaries or otherwise. I also use caciques as a means to highlight networks, right? In networks of people across space. This is in some of the early chapters where I tried to kind of think about the movement of particular caciques to highlight spatial corridors that people were moving through, imperfect as the information we might have. I would say that tolderias, and this is, I've talked about this a fair amount with charruas of the 21st century, and I think they would tend to agree, tends to more precisely represent the locality of social organization, more accurately represents mobility, right? Tolderia simply meaning a collection of toldos, right? A collection of structures. Less than as an economic term, I think about it more as a spatial term, as a mobile encampment, and to focus on the materiality, right, of where particular things are happening, as opposed to making assertions based upon perceived ethnic allegiances or perceived ethnic affiliation. So there's more I could say there. I feel like I'm starting to get to the point where I'm droning on. So I'm going to cut my answer there. But it's a very, I would want to repeat and affirm that is a very important question, because I don't think we have via sources the precise language that we might have. But we might want to, as you point out, really highlight the promise and the limits of the particular terms that we're using. So thank you very much for that question.
Okay, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. And our last question of the day for the advance of the hour, and I thank you everybody for sticking around, is Sean Austin asking to Jeff here an intra-panel action.
Not to avoid wearing Jeff out, maybe I'll move that question to email, and we can address that another time. It was more of a curiosity than anything else. So if anyone else has another question.
Now you got our first curious, man.
Well, the question was about, I mean, the landmarkers, Jeff, that you described, that's interesting to me, because it made me think about the Pedral, the stone markers that these early expeditions in the 15th and 16th centuries used to map these new territories that the Portuguese are entering, and who, I think if I understand right, they had the coordinates of Jerusalem. And so it had this really kind of apocalyptic religious sort of tone to them. And I wonder if you found in your study of the ways in which borders evolve over time, if this apocalypticism, if this religious aspect is completely erased, or if you still see vestiges of it in what you describe, I think really cogently as a kind of secularization of space in some ways, and a different way of marking space.
So thank you for that question. I don't know that I have a great answer. In thinking about these stone markers, which were also, I think one thing that's significant about them is they were obelisks, right? So they're very much this, right? Perhaps I'm wrong here, but something I often identify as a symbol of like the late 18th century, right? Of a stone obelisk. And they were in that form. Like if you were to go to Santa Teresa today in Uruguay, you would still see the remnants of part of one. So to me, in terms of aesthetic, I tend to identify them more with that sort of Enlightenment era aesthetic. Though I would say that it's not just stone markers that are being erected. In this particular region it is, but in other spaces it's markings on trees, it's markings on the landscape in different sorts of ways. I will take advantage to just highlight what I found was one of the fun anecdotes in researching this book. is that after the mapping, and this goes back a little bit to Fabio's earlier question, when the mapping expeditions go through this area that I'm highlighting in the book, right? So one, they spend a lot of time along the coast, they're patrolling contrabandists, and then when they get to what I see as native lands, then they do it in like a month, where they just zip through, they cover the same amount of space. But then they have to go back and put the stone markers there. And when they do, some of them are writing that this doesn't make any sense because the Minuanos are just going to knock them over. Like that there's wild livestock that's going to knock them over, and then the Minuanos are going to knock them over because it's in their lands. And they actually go back and they meet with particular caciques to get permission to be able to put the stone markers there as markers of sovereignty for the two crowns. So nothing that it's totally an aside from your question. I don't know about religious significance. I would suggest that I don't see it as readily visible in the stone markers that are there.
Well, thank you. That is like an amazing. And I remember one anecdote that you mentioned too of one stone markers that are not stone markers, but like poles that served as markers, that the bulls would hit these markers. So another piece of interesting anecdote from your research that you have shared in the past. Folks, thank you very much. Before we disband for today, tomorrow, the Almohandro Institute, our generous host, will be sending a reminder with the link. And the link for the sessions will be the same. It's going to be the same Zoom link that you have. It's going to work again. And you will receive another reminder approximately an hour before our session tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll be convening at noon at 12 o'clock, mediodía de Washington. So we need to adjust. I believe it's 2 o'clock in Brasilia time. That should be 6 o'clock in France and 9 o'clock in California. Sorry, Alex and the West Coast crew. That will be a brunch time, perhaps. So, but thank you, all the authors and our participants and everybody who came to join us here on Zoom from all over the world. Muchísimas gracias y muito obrigado. And enjoy your Friday night. I wish we could go for dinner. See you all tomorrow.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you, don Fabricio.
Gracias.